13 states, one federal auditor, and a decades-old amendment being used to liquidate state healthcare mandates. We are witnessing a massive regulatory collision where the Weldon Amendment is being deployed as a forensic tool to override the operating procedures of Maine's insurance market. While the administration calls it a compliance review, the governors on the front line are calling it a political hostile takeover of reproductive rights. The ledger of state sovereignty is under audit, and the cost of noncompliance could be the total forfeiture of federal healthcare funding. This is the moment where the rules of conscience meet the mandates of the state, and for Camillo's house, we are documenting how a 20-year-old line item is being used to trigger a systemic default on Maine's reproductive healthcare laws. I am Camillo Motato, and this is Camillo's house. As a certified public accountant focused on forensic verification, I look past the political rhetoric to see the underlying regulatory framework that governs our lives. In any high-level audit, the first thing you look for is a material inconsistency between federal law and state operating procedures. We are performing a forensic compliance audit on the Trump administration's decision to investigate 13 states, including Maine, over their abortion laws. We are documenting a scenario where the Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights is auditing whether state insurance mandates are discriminating against healthcare entities that refuse to provide or cover abortions. This isn't just a policy debate. It is a fiduciary standoff that could result in the liquidation of billions of dollars in federal healthcare transfers if these states are found to be in statutory default. The operational trigger for this investigation is the 2005 Weldon Amendment. In professional auditing, an amendment acts as a permanent restriction on how funds can be allocated. The Weldon Amendment prohibits federal agencies from providing funds to any state or local government that subjects a healthcare entity, including insurers and health plans, to discrimination because it does not provide, pay for, or refer for abortions. From a forensic perspective, the HHS is auditing whether Maine's 2019 insurance law creates an anti-competitive environment for conscience-based healthcare providers. Paula Stannard, the director of the Office for Civil Rights, has issued a direct disclosure stating that these investigations are launched to address an alleged disregard of or confusion about federal compliance. In accounting terms, the federal government is performing a review of internal controls to ensure that state mandates aren't overriding federal protections for conscience assets. Maine's insurance ledger has been under a specific operating procedure since 2019. State law currently requires that any state-regulated health insurance plan offering maternity services must also include coverage for abortion services. From an investigative standpoint, this is a mandatory service clause that the Trump administration views as a direct violation of the Weldon Amendment. The conflict centers on whether a state has the regulatory authority to mandate a service that a private entity refuses to provide based on conscience capital. If the HHS determines that Maine's law discriminates against insurers by forcing them to choose between market participation and ethical compliance, then the state could be found in material breach of the federal contract. This is a high-risk audit because the penalty for such a breach is the potential loss of all HHS funding, a social cost that would bankrupt the healthcare safety net of the entire state. Governor Janet Mills has issued a scathing response to this investigation, labeling it a facade aimed at restricting access. Mills is currently in the middle of a high-volatility race for the U.S. Senate, and this federal audit has become a primary asset in her political narrative. She is framing the investigation as a management override by the executive branch intended to undermine fundamental rights. From a risk management perspective, Mills is doubling down on her performance review as a defender of reproductive freedom. She argues that Maine will not be intimidated into delisting its healthcare protections. In her view, the compliance review is not a neutral audit, but a tactical strike designed to impair the branding of Democratic governors across the country. By pushing back so aggressively, Mills is signaling to her shareholders, the voters of Maine, that she is the only asset capable of standing in the way of federal overreach. There is a significant information gap in the administration's discrimination narrative. Bob Carey, the superintendent of the Maine Bureau of Insurance, has disclosed a material fact that complicates the federal audit. Maine's law already includes exemptions for religious employers. However, His office has not received a single request for such an exemption since the law was passed in 2019. In auditing terms, this is what we call a zero transaction history. If no entity has actually requested an exemption and been denied, then where is the measurable discrimination? The federal government is performing a prospective audit, investigating a potential liability that is not yet manifested in the actual results of the state's insurance market. This suggests that the Weldon investigation is a preemptive strike intended to create a regulatory chilling effect rather than to settle an active claim of discrimination. We must also audit the 13-state portfolio targeted by the HHS. The list includes California, Colorado, Delaware, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. All of these states are led by Democratic governors, with the sole exception of Vermont's Phil Scott. From a forensic analysis of the sample selection, it is clear that the federal government is auditing for ideology. When a compliance review is focused almost exclusively on the blue-chip subsidiaries of the Democratic Party, it creates a perception of bias that undermines the integrity of the audit. The administration is essentially performing a consolidated audit of the reproductive healthcare ledger in the most liberal markets in the country. They are looking to reconcile these state laws with the federal standard established by the Weldon Amendment, a move that could liquidate the unique healthcare mandates of millions of Americans. The legal overhead of this standoff is immense. Every state involved in this consolidated audit is likely to file a countersuit if the HHS attempts to withhold funding. In the world of public sector accounting, this is an accrued liability for litigation that will consume hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxpayer resources. Janet Mills has already stated that she will fight tooth and nail to defend the state's laws. This legal conflict is a non-productive asset for the taxpayer, money being spent to argue over regulatory jurisdiction instead of improving the quality of care. The Weldon Amendment has become the weapon of choice for an administration that wants to deregulate abortion access by regulating the states that protect it. We also have to look at the timing of the disclosure. This investigation was announced just as the DHS shutdown reached its peak and the national security ledger was in total disarray. From an investigative strategy standpoint, this is what we call a diversionary disclosure. By opening a high-profile culture war audit on 13 states, the administration is attempting to shift the market focus away from its operational failures at the airports and borders. It is a management move intended to consolidate the base by performing a moral audit of its political opponents. If you can't balance the budgetary ledger in Washington, you audit the reproductive ledger in Maine. The social contract between the federal government and the states is currently in a state of material instability. The Weldon Amendment was designed as a narrow protection for individual conscience, but it is being expanded by the Trump administration into a universal override for state healthcare mandates. This reevaluation of the law is a systemic risk to the concept of federalism. If a federal agency can impair a state's insurance market based on a compliance review of a 20-year-old amendment, then the autonomy of the state ledger is functionally null and void. We are looking at a hostile takeover of state authority, where the federal auditor has the power to liquidate any law they find inconsistent with their political philosophy. The final reconciliation of the Weldon Amendment audit of March 2026 shows an administration that is fully leveraged on the issue of religious and conscience protections. They are using the HHS as a forensic weapon to audit the conscience of the entire country. The zero exemption history in Maine proves that the discrimination being investigated is a paper liability, a theoretical conflict used to justify a very real political strike. Janet Mills is positioning herself as the guarantor of reproductive equity, a role that will determine her market value in the upcoming Senate primary. She is betting that the voters as auditors will prefer a defiant executive over a compliant federal subject. My forensic verdict on this investigation is that it is a tactical misuse of the audit function. A compliance review should be based on material evidence of a breach, not a strategic desire to override state policy. By targeting only Democratic-led states and using a moot liability like the Maine insurance law, the HHS has committed a reputational default on its own civil rights mandate. The Weldon Amendment was never intended to be a battering ram against state sovereignty, but in the hands of this administration, it has become a consolidated debt collection against reproductive freedom. The cost of this audit will be measured in lost trust, skyrocketing legal fees, and a systemic breakdown in the cooperation between Augusta and Washington. I want to hear from you. Is the Weldon Amendment a necessary internal control to protect the rights of conscience, or is it being used as a forensic facade to restrict healthcare access? Does the fact that 0 religious exemptions have been requested in Maine prove that this investigation is a bad faith audit? Let me know in the comments. Your perspective is the only audit that matters when the future of federalism and reproductive freedom are sitting on the negotiation table. I'm Camilo Motado for Camilo's House. Subscribe to stay informed on the numbers, the laws, and the truth behind the headlines. Stay safe.